Group policy allows for centralized management of user accounts and computer accounts. It also greatly eases the management burden of the IT support staff. Using group policy, I can manage dozens, hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of computers. Group policy also allows for testing of configuration settings before they're deployed, which greatly reduces misconfigurations. Some of the configuration settings we will look at using group policy will be managing network settings, desktop settings, security policies, folder redirection, software deployment, application restrictions, logon scripts, audit policies, and many other settings. Everything I cover in this course, I will show you how to configure. So the goal of this course is not just to have technical knowledge of how these settings actually work, but how they are actually deployed within the environment. Let's get started. On my domain controller, I'm going to pull up the Group Policy Management console. So I'm going to navigate to Server Manager. In Server Manager, I'm going to go to my administrative tools on this tools link. When I select that, Group Policy Management is in the list. I'm also going to open Active Directory users and computers while we're here. So I'm going to click on that and that'll open as well. And I'm just going to minimize Server Manager. In the Group Policy Management console we've opened, I have my Active Directory forest, rts.local. Under the forest there's a domains folder. I am in a single domain forest. rts.local is my only domain, but under that domains would list every domain in the forest. Now when I select rts.local, one of the first things you notice is that there is a default domain policy under rts.local. That's the policy we referenced in the previous section, and we said that policy is created by default when you install Active Directory, so it's always present. This also has my OU structure. You will also remember from an earlier section the difference between an organizational unit, or OU, and the difference between a container. Containers cannot have group policy objects linked directly to them. Organizational units can have group policy objects linked to them. So the only OUs I have in my domain are the Boston OU, and I have a domain controller's OU. If I wanted to link a group policy object to Boston, I could just right-click the Boston OU, and there's an option to create a GPO and link it to this location. That's what I'm going to choose. I'm going to name this Boston Desktop Settings. So anyone that looks at the name will know this policy was created to facilitate applying settings to Boston. I created that policy and it was linked at the same time to the Boston OU. If I expand this group policy objects container further down the list, you'll see that policy now shows up under the group policy objects container. That is the repository for all group policy objects. They are linked to other locations, sites, domains, organizational units, but this is the repository where you will find all of the GPOs that you have. For a group policy to apply, your account, user account or computer account, must be under the scope of that policy. The easiest way I find to think of that, the scope of a policy is where it's linked to and everything under it. This policy that we just linked to the Boston OU only applies to user accounts, computer accounts, if they are in the Boston OU. If I switch back to Active Directory users and computers, I'm going to expand my domain, and I have the Boston OU. Well, right now the Boston OU has no users in it. That policy we created would have no effect on anyone because there are no accounts in Boston. If I go to my users container, I'm just going to click on Bob Ross and drag him to Boston. When I move Bob Ross to Boston, now any group policy object that's linked to Boston would apply to Bob Ross. If I move a computer account, if I move RTSCL2 to Boston, any computer settings defined in group policy would now apply to RTSCL2. This message we get whenever we move an object in Active Directory says, moving objects in Active Directory domain services can prevent your existing system from working the way it was designed. For example, moving an OU can affect the way that group policies are applied to the accounts within the OU. Well, another example of that, moving a computer account from one OU to another OU, or in this case, from a container to an OU, would affect group policies. If your computer account is in Boston, you get the policies that apply to Boston. If you're not in Boston, you do not get those policies. Always a concern when I move a user account or computer account from one location to another in Active Directory is, what is the end result? Which policies will be lost, which policies will be gained, and what settings will be modified. So for RTS-CL2, I'm going to say yes, I want to move that. Now when I click on Boston, Bob Ross and RTS-CL2 are both in that location. Well, if we go back to the Group Policy Management console, I now know any settings I define in this Boston Desktop Settings GPO would apply. I can also define policies at the site level. Site level policies are so rarely used that by default no site levels are available. If I want to set a site policy, I have to right click, select Show Sites. This would give you a list of every site. You would have to select it here and select OK. Now it shows up, and now I would have the ability to link an existing GPO. So it is very telling that by default, Microsoft does not even give you an option in the view to link a policy to a site. They force you to add it first. That just means they know that it's not that common that we are using site level policies. The majority of policies will be at the OU level, since that is as close as I can get to a user account or to a computer account. Now, the policies are exactly the same. A policy simply can apply to a site domain or an OU, and even to a local machine, but the settings in the policies for the most part are the same. There are a few settings that are removed from local policies, but still very similar. By default, we have over 2,500 settings in group policy, and we can actually add additional templates to gain more settings. I'm going to edit this Boston Desktop Settings policy. When I edit that, it shows me the two parts of a GPO, computer configuration and user configuration. Computer configuration settings apply each time the computer starts up. It has no relationship to the user that logs into the computer. Those settings will be processed before I even log on to the machine. User configuration settings apply when the user logs on, and they are independent of the computer. If my user uses a laptop and a desktop, when they authenticate from either of those machines with their user account, they will get the same user configuration settings. For example, if I've mapped a network drive under user configuration, it does not matter what computer in the domain my user authenticates from, they will have the same mapped network drive. On the other hand, under computer configuration, well, to take a look at just a possible setting, I'm going to expand my policies. I'm going to just resize this window so we have a better view. Under Policies, I'm going to select Administrative Templates. Under Administrative Templates, I'm going to click on System. Under System, if we expand that, under System, there is a Device Installation. I'm going to click on that, and under that I have Device Installation Restrictions. Now you can also see on the right there are quite a few settings that live under Device Installation. But if I go to the Restrictions, so I'm going to click on Device Installation Restrictions, well, we get a few other options. Well, one of those, prevent installation of removable devices. If I double click that, the description here that shows up in the help pane is extremely important. Before I enable or disable a setting in policy, it is imperative that we know exactly what the setting does. Many of these are pretty straightforward. You can look at the name of a policy and you know what it does. Others are not quite as straightforward. So always read the description to make sure it does what you intend for it to do. Well, I could simply enable this setting. If I were to do that, no one would be able to install removable devices on this computer. Or I should say, on computers that this policy applies to. Keep in mind, if we scroll back to the top here, this is under computer configuration. So it has no relationship to your user account. it would not matter what user logged onto this computer. The computer itself has a policy that says you could not use removable devices. So on the user side, if we looked at the ability to map a network drive, I'm going to just drill down through my preferences, and there is an option for drive maps. If I were to do that at the user configuration level, then that would be independent of the computer, and it would process that user logon regardless of the computer my user logged into. Now for us, we are not concerned about the settings in group policy. Again, there are more than 2,500. Our concern is more how group policy works and the processing order of group policy and the locations it can be linked, which are local, site, domain, and organizational unit.